Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Evazine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off.
Blast off on another episode of Hero Paranormal Podcast. My name is Ryan, the original overseer of the airwaves, bringing you an epic episode tonight. We are broadcasting from the base at La Madre Mountain, just south of Area 51, and I'll tell you, I am going to have some fun with this one because this is a huge deal. The guest is Mark Olly, and we're going to be talking about crystal skulls and human heads, the mystical history of glass and the extinction of the world. In a time when the world realized that it is not immortal, this little book brings an entirely new view of what it means to be human, what the planet really is, how something as simple as a few grains of sand revolutionized civilization, how extinction is simply a part of nature, and how the whole of life we are so comfortably fit in may not be quite what it seems. Nature, science, and technology combine to show the past, present, and future like never before. A life and death passage through realms largely unknown to us, but not to those ancient giants of intelligence who came before us. Author Mark Olly seamlessly combines the disciplines of archaeology, geology, science, and human studies to push the boundaries of human existence, wider in both directions, and increase our appreciation of just exactly what the human race could potentially be capable of achieving. Far from being an end in itself, this book takes the reader on a magical mystery tour like no other. It enlivens the mind, it reaches some startling conclusions, and may just change the way we see our future. Mark Olly, welcome to the Hero Paranormal Podcast.
Hi, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited because this is something that is very important to me. I think it's very mysterious. It answers a lot of questions. And let's face it, crystal skulls are becoming one of the hottest topics in the paranormal field. How did you find yourself researching this and getting into just exactly what it is you got into?
Wow. Well, obviously it begins when my archaeological career began, which was, my dad used to be a volunteer digger back in the 60s and 70s before archaeology became a set discipline, which it effectively is now. And when I was 8 years old, he got me into digging in holes and pulling out Roman stuff and all that sort of thing. So I started very, very early, did a lot of voluntary work over here. Eventually I went to art college, and then the museum in this town is directly opposite the art college. So at the same time as I was studying art for the 2 years I was there, I was also studying archaeology as an extension studies thing to Liverpool University. So by this point, late teens going into early 20s, I spent a long time then as an archaeologist. Also, my mum and dad were collectors, so they collected a huge number of bizarre objects. That's rubbed off on me as well. After a long career in the music business, eventually I've retired and I've come back to doing writing, television and various other bits and bobs. And then a friend of mine came to me, this is the answer to your question really, a friend of mine came to me and said, I've got this really, really old friend who spent time in South America, and when he was in South America, it could even have been when he was a young lad between the wars or whatever, he befriended people in a village there and was given an Aztec crystal skull. Now, this chap's getting too old to be the custodian of it, so he then passed it on to the guy who I know, who's quite high up in Freemasonry. But this guy is himself quite old, so he came to me and he said, well, I think you should be the next custodian. And I'm like, oh, well, what made you, make that decision? he said, well, you're an archaeologist, you're a historian, and you appreciate the spiritual side of things, the bigger sort of human existence, if you like. So I think you'd really appreciate this. So I said, oh, okay, all right then. So anyway, I ended up with this Aztec skull. It's about 500 to 800 years old, we think. That's based on the way that it's made. It's handmade, and stylistically, it's of that sort of just on the cusp of the pre-Columbian sort of Cortes invasion period in the late 1400s, early 1500s. It kind of matches in with that. So I ended up with this crystal skull. And that sort of inspired me to try and find out more, to do more research, to look at more to do with the crystal skulls. And also, I mean, human heads, generally speaking, appear in every single period of history because it's our history. So I thought that's a fantastic thread for a book. You could say human head, and you could go to any time period or any place that humans of any kind have lived anywhere on planet Earth. They've all got human heads. And there's so much information we can get from them. So I'm then left with the two things which essentially make the book, which is the human side of it, the human remains, and then what we as human beings did with that as an image, how we then went on to produce carvings and crystal skulls and the reasons behind that. There you go. It was a long answer, but we got there in the end.
That's so fascinating, and I'm amazed by your disciplines, not only in archaeology, geology, and science, but human studies, and you've kind of pushed the boundaries, and you have gone into advanced ministry as well, which I believe that in the biblical studies, this really stands out to me because you really have a grasp of, like you said, the big picture of where this fits into humanity. So you got this.
I always used to say with this book, as I was writing it, so it took about 2 years to put it together, I always used to say it's going to be a tiny book with an enormous story to tell. So if there's kind of a zip line to it that isn't in print, that's it. It's a tiny book with an enormous story to tell.
Yeah, it is. It's amazing. And, I also kind of have the hobby of collecting antiques, and I'm very, very interested in the Freemasonry aspect of this too. And that kind of ties in with spirituality.
Yeah. Well, this friend of mine who is fairly high up in Freemasonry, he's worked his way through all the degrees and to become a lodge master. And he obviously then, as a responsible person for that particular lodging district, was then highly regarded by the chap who actually had this skull, who I believe was also in some way connected with Freemasonry. Obviously, Freemasonry itself has changed over the years, so let's hypothetically assume that the chap that originally got the skull probably acquired it, say the 1940s, 1950s. A lot of stuff found its way over here during the war years and the post-war years. He in turn has then passed it on to someone he respects, but that someone is as well quite old, because you don't sort of progress in Freemasonry at any particular great speed. Your first, your second, your third is probably 3 to 4 years. After that, it takes a long time to actually rise to any kind of level in Freemasonry. But the chap then who then ended up with the skull, so we're now only 2 steps away from the original owners in South America, that chap again is now older than me. I mean, I'm heading towards my 60th at the end of this year, so I'm no spring chicken. As you say, it's been a long life with a lot of qualifications and a lot of experience, and I've really, how can I say, taken the bull by the horns. I've really gone at it because, life is for living, and I suppose that's reflected in my musical career as well, because I've still managed to hold that down and do everything else as well. In that respect, I suppose I'm now in a position that those Freemasons were when the skull was passed on. So I've ended up with it now. There's a big exhibition coming up in Blackpool. It's a conference called the Awakening Conference. It's being done this summer. I think it's in June. It's in the 20-somethings of June. Eric von Daniken's going to be there, and a lot of other fairly well-known folks, and they want to put on an exhibition of antiquities there. So they've picked me to curate that and to look after that, which I think is amazing. And it's little opportunities like that will get a chance for this skull and a lot of other objects to be placed in front of the public. the public can actually see these things, because there's an awful lot of stuff in private collections, and it'd be nice to see these things coming out and people to be able to see them.
That really stood out to me, that you are actually involved with these exhibitions. And when you do have these exhibitions, Mark, are people, you often hear, or at least I have often heard, that when people become close in proximity to some of these items, they have very real experiences. Have you had that happen?
Well, the simple answer is yes. I could think of all kinds of stories where ancient objects have, as it were, imparted their information. I'll give you a couple of examples. I actually own the oldest man-made object in where I live here in Cheshire. It's 480,000 BC. It's a Hoxnean tool. It's from the days of the woolly mammoths and post Ice Age and all that sort of thing. And one lady came along and she picked this up because it was in a display. It's only a stone, so she can't damage it. She picked this thing up and just held it. And she went, oh. She said, I can see this hunter outlined against a sheet of ice, and he's got antlers on his head, and he's some kind of ceremonial shaman, and I can see him. Now, this is just an ordinary lady who doesn't really know anything about archaeology or history. What she didn't realise is the ice would have been here. She described a scene that was possible at the site where that particular object was recovered. And just down the road at Starcar, we've actually got antlered headpieces. We've got these pieces that they used to wear with antlers on. So every single piece of information she gave me was archaeologically, historically, and location-based correct. And all she did was pick the stone up. And then the same thing happened again. We were excavating a Bronze Age barrow over here, and we ended up with a bucket with some ash in it, ash remains, which later turned out to be a cremation burial. So these are human remains. And this lady was amazed by this. She picked it up and she was saying, I think it used to be a fella that was in here. And what she didn't know is that actually the person that was cremated was most likely a warrior and probably was male, because they came from the top of the burial mound. But what was fantastic was she actually came from a place called Newtonley Willows, and the excavation of the barrow took place in Newtonley Willows.
Wow.
So, and this was an exhibition many, many miles away. This is in Derbyshire, in Buxton, where this had turned up. So the lady who lived in exactly the same physical location that this archaeological, these remains were recovered, had connected with the remains. But there's a difference of about 6,500 years in the age. So that was, again, it's one of these things, and they just happen. These things just seem to happen again and again and again and again. People, back to the crystal skulls again, people that have picked up this skull, it's just slightly smaller than adult size, and it doesn't look like anything when you approach it. It just looks like a clear piece of plastic or whatever. But as soon as you pick it up, it weighs a ton. It's really heavy. The weight to size ratio is quite hefty. And as you pick it up, of course, it's freezing cold because it's proper quartz. It's the real McCoy. It's the proper crystal. And then straight away, this thing sat there generating this enormous electrical field, which is what quartz does. And people do sort of get that, they kind of go, wow, this is so powerful. And it definitely connects with people, and it does give them a bit of a blast. So you've got the physical weight, you've got the physical temperature, and then you've got this huge electrical discharge that's coming off it. I tried to go into this in the book because some people believe that these skulls have got things to impart, that they're actually recorders. And when I was writing the book, I thought, there can't possibly be a scientific explanation for this. There can't be any science behind it. And then over here, I think it was Southampton University, they've now started using lasers to write data into glass silicon discs, which they can read back. Now, all of a sudden, you're thinking, hang on a minute, there's a skull made of quartz silica, there's a disc made of quartz silica. The only problem here is we just don't know how to read the crystals. We've developed a system now to read the discs, but we can't read the crystals. So there could just be more to it. There could just be something in that legend that developed in the 1970s and 80s about these skulls, containing all kinds of ancient information. Maybe that is absolutely true, but maybe it's also true of all the quartz that's in the environment around us. We just can't read it yet. Does that kind of answer that question?
It does, because this seems like a very genuinely, it makes sense. I mean, we have quartz, we have mystical powers that have been felt by many people, and some claims have been presented that there may even be healing qualities. Have you come across that at all?
I have. The closest I come to it in the book is I discuss the high content of quartz silica in the environment around us, and then I discuss where that ends up in us. And the interesting connection there, it's a bit of a wow factor in the book, is that the lack of silicon in human development actually affects the brain and the skull. So if you're a baby and you're developing in the womb and you don't get enough silicon, the deficiency affects the head. Now, I've got no idea how the guys that made the crystal skulls knew that there was a connection, but that is the connection. There's also the idea that planet Earth itself is a giant quartz crystal flying through the galaxy, because the Earth's core only functions if it's made from quartz silica. So we're carbon life forms living in a silica world, but at the end of the day, it's the silica in us that seems to be relating to the environment around us. So there has to be some form of communication. There has to be some connection. You've got this, as above, so below, you've got this microcosm thing going on, where we contain everything that we find in the planet around us, which then contains everything that's in the universe around us. So because we're so connected, we're so absolutely linked to our environment, there has to be an exchange of some kind going on between us and our environment. And the crystals, as you pointed out, people that believe in crystal healing and that, the different types of rocks and what they contain and their properties scientifically must interact with us in some way, because everything else does. Water affects us, heat affects us, sticking your fingers in a plug socket will affect you because that's electricity. We're affected by all those things. So why wouldn't we be affected by the energy that's given off by parts of planet Earth when we're so connected to it? To me, it just makes perfect sense.
It does sort of just make perfect sense. And the symbolism also makes perfect sense. The symbolic meaning of the human skull and how it's usually commonly symbolically used as representations of death, mortality, and the unachievable nature of immortality. The secret societies, people obviously often talk about the Skull and Bones Society and other societies. A lot of Freemasonry uses the Skull and Bones in various rituals. And it has, I'm really glad that you're so knowledgeable of the spiritual aspects, because as you said, it's not just one culture. This is widely known throughout the world. And it's amazing how all these cultures agree on the symbolism of the skull. And the information that you have is fascinating. Now, I saw, I cannot remember the name of it. I saw something on National Geographic about crystal skulls and how they may be a form of computer, which sounds very similar to what you're saying about this quartz and this silica.
Yeah. Well, it was said in the 1970s, there was this idea that maybe out there was some mystical number of skulls made of crystal, maybe 12 or 13, and that one day these skulls would be reunited and they would either, light up or give out some information or, herald the beginning of a spiritual transformation of some kind. And everybody in the sort of ordinary scientific community just sort of went, here we go again, what's this going to be all about? But the more that we've looked at silicon, I mean, at the end of the day, the windows in our houses are made of silica. We wear glasses made of silica. We're talking to each other on computers and phones that contain silicon chips. So that's silica. Computers function using silicon chips. It's everywhere. It's in building materials. It's in bath sealant. It's in concrete. You name it. It's absolutely everywhere. it's one of the fundamental building blocks of science itself. Without silicon, the world wouldn't exist. It wouldn't function in the way that it does. And I think I spent there's a whole chapter that explores that in the book, that kind of goes into the what can you do with it, and it covers everything from prehistoric flints, which can cut like knives at a molecular level. It goes all the way from that, which is quite primitive technology, right the way through to this idea that by making perfect quartz spheres and firing them out into space, they could actually prove that there was gravitational drag around planet Earth because of the way these balls function. There's only 3 sets of perfect spheres ever been made, and one of the sets is made from quartz silica. So it's enormously advanced science at the same time as being incredibly primitive. And as you said, the skull and the representation of the skull, and then the uses and the functions of silica, they're common pretty much to everybody, everywhere, all over planet Earth. And you've got this idea that, once upon a time there was a super race that lived on planet Earth and they left behind, traces. And everybody goes, oh, well, it's got to be the pyramids, or, it's got to be geometry, or, we should be looking for this, that, and the other. And, well, one of those things that seems to have been left behind is the properties of quartz silica and the way that the head is represented and what it represents. Universally, it seems to be, as a skull, a representation of the exiting of life, in the same way that birth and the rest of it is represented as arriving, and you've got sort of the goddess culture and all that side of things, if you like, that's arrival. Well, departure is the skull. But when you find it in a lot of the occult societies, and you find it in Freemasonry, etc., it usually sits there somewhere prominent to remind everybody that everybody is mortal. Nobody gets out of here alive unless you happen to be resurrected or translated. But there are exceptions to the rule always. But as a rule, none of us are going to get out of here alive.
Yeah, we have a common bond when it comes to that, and something very interesting I find with these crystal skulls is the belief that some have, and you surely have probably come across this in your travels, the belief some have that maybe they were not made by humans, or that extraterrestrials may be involved in the production. They don't have, for example, the characteristical features of Mesoamerican, wooden rods with stone, very, very, very distinctive marks and rudimentary tools that the Aztecs, the Mayans, etc., used to carve stone. Has the extraterrestrial aspect come across your radar at all?
Okay, there's 2 parts to that. One part of it is the manufacture of the skulls, which, using modern day technology, we can actually establish whether they are, in a sense, real, genuinely old skulls, or modern day, banged out of a workshop in the thousands yesterday kind of skulls, by looking at the tool marks on the skulls. I think the one you're thinking of, the main one, is the Mitchell Hedges skull, which is the one that Anna Mitchell Hedges found under an altar on an excavation site in Belize, as it was back then. That one has been very rigorously examined from a microscopic point of view, and there's just no manufacturing marks on it. So it's supernatural in that sense, but then it just depends how long people sat there and actually polished it for. It kind of proves beyond all possible doubt that it probably took 100 years to smooth that down to the level it is now. Whoever made it, because quartz silica is quite difficult to work with. Most of the other skulls, if not all of the other skulls, that appear to be handmade have some kind of tool marks on them. So that's the really exceptional one. The aliens connection, usually that drifts in, it floats in as part of the idea that the guys that were in South America that had these enormous stretched skulls, they had these huge elongated skulls, the idea that because people thought they were aliens, that maybe it was that particular race that was producing the skulls. That's your alien connection. not many people would imagine the greys coming out of a huge silver disc carrying a skull. That's Steven Spielberg. We're quite firmly in the kingdom of the crystal skull there. But if anybody wants to know the background to that movie, please buy the book, because the book will explain to you where the scriptwriters and where Steven got all his ideas for the movie from. But he's linked them all together to come up with a scenario at the end, which is, jolly good Hollywood. But the guys with the long skulls, as it turns out, South America, archaeologists and scientists are starting to take them more seriously and look at them. It turns out their DNA and their physical skull structures are very, very different from ours. And it's really starting to look like we've got another species of human there. They are still us by definition of DNA, but they're just not the same form of us. They're very different. And I do go into that in the earlier parts of the book when I'm looking at, a lot of the fossil record and a lot of the early remains of humans going back 30, 40,000 BC are starting to give up evidence that we were quite diverse, the same as all the other species on planet Earth. You have a tiny little cat in the jungle that will sit in the palm of your hand, or you can cross a lion and a tiger and get a liger that's the size of a horse. Well, it looks like human beings were very much like that. You would have tiny little Homo floresiensis, which are these 3'6" high guys living on islands out in the Pacific, or you could go all the way through to the biblical giants, these enormous human beings. Robert Wadlow, who was a giant over here, lived to the height of 9'11". He died in his late 20s. That's still pretty substantial. You're still looking at a human being there that's 10 foot, massive hands, massive feet. And he's not unique in history. So we have records of people of that size. But the biblical giants, you're looking at 20, 30 foot plus in terms of height. But if you are, strictly speaking, sticking to DNA, and you're a scientist and an environmentalist, you have to admit that we as a species should be as diverse as all the other species, because no species is exempt from that. The diversity is present in all of the different species, and that's proven again by the fossil record. So even extinct species have ended up, proving diverse. And there are offshoots and variations and varieties of species. So the same should be true of us, aside from just, skin colour and minor physical attributes. So again, science is beginning to back up mythology here. We're back into the realms of, what might have been nonsense 30 or 40 or 50 years ago. Now it's kind of flipping the other way. It's beginning to look like, it's not nonsense, actually. The ancients were absolutely right in a lot of the legends and the things that they wrote. They were correct in what they were saying. That's how it's beginning to look.
Yeah, I'm so glad you went down this path, because and mentioned Belize, because I was originally born in Costa Rica, and there are some stone spheres in Costa Rica that, although not related to the crystal skulls, they provide sort of a more documentation that these oddities were occurring. And these stone spheres are an assortment of over 300 spheres on this delta, on Isla del Caño. And locally, they are kind of known as they call them the bolas de piedra, and they're huge rocks, perfectly smooth. They can't figure out in that time period, first of all, how they were made. It seems absolutely absurd that these spheres were made, and to that extent. And, it is, like you said, that what was the purpose? What was the purpose? And I also find it very interesting that there is, in a lot of cultures in Central and South America, as you said, we have the other very strange aspect, which is these pyramids, which we also see in Egypt, although they're step pyramids in the Americas. And it brings me back to a lot of the work that many like Brian Forrester are doing, and these elongated skulls. It all seems to be connected, doesn't it?
I believe it is. Yes, I actually do believe it is connected. The Costa Rica balls themselves just prove that as far as messing about with stone is concerned, they were far better at it in the past than we are now. So finding advanced forms of stonework, especially in South Americas, shouldn't come as a surprise to people. The face masks, the sculptures themselves, the skulls, the balls, the stonework. I've been down to Yucatan Peninsula myself, and I've had a wander around and a look at what's down there. Just because it's covered in trees doesn't mean it's primitive. Get rid of the jungle, and there's a breathtaking culture down there to match anything you'll find anywhere in the world. It's in some ways it's better than Egypt. It's just breathtaking. So the possibility for the advanced technology down there is absolute. Why not? And then, like you say, the connectedness of different scattered or apparently scattered societies around the world is something that, as 21st century people, we are not coping well with, because in the past, the Victorians always used to say it's primitive, they were all isolated, we're advancing, our technology's moving forward, we're getting better, etc. So the idea that actually, no, that's not true, the idea that there were advanced, connected, societies with uniform, universal paradigms that they work to, where they have things in common, that doesn't sit very well in the 21st century with a lot of people. But, why the guys with the enormous stretched heads who were building step pyramids in South America, why they couldn't have stayed in communication with the guys with the enormous stretched heads building step pyramids in Egypt, or anywhere else for that matter, why they couldn't have stayed in contact, I don't know. Whereas now we're flying around up in the air with aeroplanes and driving petrol-driven vehicles up and down roads, back then, they were using the wind, and they were on the oceans, and they were using the rivers. But, as far as human beings are concerned, they were every bit as intelligent and clever as we are. They were just doing things differently. They were just doing it a different way. And I think what's happening is people have lost sight of that fact. If you got hold of one or two of the guys from 3,000 or 4,000 years ago and stuck them in a suit and planted them in the middle of a modern city, sooner or later they'd come to terms with everything very, very quickly, because they think the same as we do. The oldest form of us, actually, the oldest form of Homo sapiens sapiens is coming out of the Czech Republic, Czechoslovakia, and they've actually got identifiable remains of us, going back to 42,000 BC. And there's organic deposits on these remains, so the dating's pretty good, and that's where a lot of this DNA is coming from, because, the preservation is excellent. And these guys, you wouldn't be able to tell them apart from us. They were exactly the same in every respect as us. Well, that's a long time. They've been absent for 50,000 years. So we're now looking at what they've left behind, and all we've got is the remnants, There's so much of what they were and what they did that's disappeared that what's left looks really strange to us. But I don't think we should be surprised by how advanced these things are, or how universal a lot of the elements are.
It is very strange how the world, as you said, is a lot smaller than it seems, and that we, as human beings, the characteristics that we point out as different are very minute, as you said, and I'm so glad you said that, because really, if we were another creature looking at ourselves, we all pretty much look the same, other than different shades and colors and things like that.
Yeah.
And from an archaeological standpoint, the Aztec crystal skull, it's an enigma, because Aztec legend holds that, their forefathers migrated to Mexico City from a land to the north, a land of red rocks and 4 rivers. And something strange, I do a lot of research in Utah, one of the states here in the United States that has a lot of high strangeness. And where the Aztecs are concerned, it is appearing more and more likely that it's possible that one of their homelands was located in Utah, and that there's 2 researchers in particular that have claimed they have found the Aztec homeland in Utah. Now, interestingly, going to things like mummies, which are technically usually considered, you think Egypt when you think mummy, there is mummies all over the world. In fact, one of the oldest is found in Nevada in the middle of the desert. And it's very strange that as you said, the world, especially now, with all the dismay and the brokenness of our world, that all these things, when you break them down, they simplify, and it seems as if they have a common origin. Have you found that in your research?
Yes, basically. I've been doing it long enough now to know that if you'd have gone back to, say, the 1970s, 1980s, when I was training as an archaeologist, in America, a lot of the significant discoveries that didn't sit well with the way that America wanted to go in at that time, the direction it was going. A lot of them were just ignored. They were covered up. They were stuck in boxes in storerooms, etc., etc. With the new age of technology and connectedness and the internet and the sort of thing we've got now, when something's found in America, it tends to get out pretty fast. So things like, the Egyptian remains in America, the Celtic remains in America, the medieval remains in America, the Viking remains in America, prehistoric remains, human remains, fossil remains. I mean, most recently, I believe there's footprints out there. You're looking at 23,000 BC now that have been recovered. Clearly, the American continent back then was as connected to everything else as any other continent, There was one lady actually came back from America. She'd found this little museum out in a backwater somewhere, and some metal detectorists had picked up this little axe head, and it had ended up in this cabinet, and she brought me a photo of it. It's identical to the Bronze Age axe heads that are found in Britain and Europe, but he got it from a secure location. So at the end of the day, everybody everywhere seems, like I said earlier, to be communicating with each other. But then that makes things a little uncomfortable for some of the tribes that are native to America, because obviously they're in conflict with, people that have come in later ages. So that kind of upsets the balance a bit. But there always was legends, even with the Native American Indians, there were legends. There was a white tribe of Indians. And over here in the Library of Wales, believe it or not, we've got this part of our country known as Wales, there's a library there that has 3 copies of a pamphlet that was printed in the 1620s. So you're going back to the days of early settlement. And this pamphlet gives an account of how a group of people from one of the valleys in Wales, one of the villages in Wales, decided they were going to emigrate to the newfound land of America. So they emigrated over there to America. What it also says is in America, one of the Native American Indian tribes said, okay, we're going to get on the boats and we're going to come the other way. And they settled in a valley here in Wales. So there was a complete exchange 350 years ago of 2 tribes, in effect, one a Celtic tribe from Wales and the other a Native American tribe from America. And they swapped. Now, apparently, I have been told that some of the DNA that's coming out of this valley in Wales proves that story is true. But there are so few of these pamphlets left. I think there's only probably half a dozen left of them in the world. They were early printed pamphlets. But things like that, you think, well, hang on, if they could do that in the 1600s, what was going on in the 1500s and the 1400s and, going back to the 1200s when supposedly people went from Scotland. You go all the way back to the 900s when you got coracles sailing out of Ireland, across the sea again. And, I don't think human beings were any less adventurous back then as we are now. It just took longer to do things. And why not come to America? What a fantastic land. What an incredible adventure that would be for folks, I mean, knights in armours in medieval times, they decided to go on crusade. They thought nothing of spending 3 years to, wander out to the Middle East and back. So why not go in the other direction? Why not head off and go across the Atlantic and see what's over there? It's nonsense to believe that these things didn't happen. They are quite obviously they did happen. There's a book, actually, that was produced, I think it was in the late 1970s, by an archaeologist called Barry Fell. And it's just called America BC. And it was so radical back then that I think it was banned. I think you could only buy it elsewhere, but you couldn't buy it in the States. So if people want to go and track that down, it'll be secondhand. It'll be on Amazon or something somewhere. Go and have a look at that. It's America BC by Barry Fell. And the stuff in that will just absolutely blow your mind. It really will.
I'm sure. That's one I haven't come across, but it sounds fantastic.
Oh, check it out. It's got Irish Ogam in it that's out there on rocks in America. It's got a Roman shipwreck that's out there in America. It's got all the Egyptian stuff. Honestly, it's unbelievable. It's well worth a look.
Now, as you said, the internet has really brought about a lot of good things. The communication, the ability for you and I to be talking right now is magical in my opinion. And
Yep.
by the same token, before we had things like the internet, many stories, legends, or myths, I guess I should call them, of larger organizations, the Smithsonian is among them, sort of hoarding these legends or trying to keep them from the public eye. Is there any truth to that, or is it possible that the powers that be have tried to hold on to some of these relics for their own purposes and not let the people understand them?
Well, the short answer is yes. But it wouldn't be much of a radio broadcast if I left it at that. Because I'm as it were, on the other side of the fence, I am actually one of those strange organisation people that come from that side. It's more complicated than that. There are a number of different reasons why something would be kept a secret. There's practical reasons, like you wouldn't want people to perhaps know where it was found, or, its existence is under investigation, tests are being done or whatever. It goes right the way across the board, all kinds of political reasons, all kinds of private reasons, till you get to the other extreme where there used to be this thing where you couldn't actually destroy somebody's, how can I put it, their lifelong work, as it were, their career. You couldn't destroy that by revealing something that undermined them. So as an act of respect, I think a lot of people were allowed to rabbit on about complete nonsense for far too long. And that's how you end up with this situation where there's lots of stuff that's been accepted for years and years and years and never corrected. Nobody's ever come along and gone, that isn't true. I've done this in a few other interviews as well, and I'm sure somebody will come and, take odds with me at some point. But evolution is one of the classics. I've got a cat here, by the way.
Okay, yeah.
Evolution is the classic one because DNA and DNA studies, there's no doubt evolution just doesn't work that way. Sorry, he's tangled up in my headset here.
Sure.
Go on, clear off. There we go. Anyway, so yeah, evolution doesn't work that way. Because DNA doesn't change. DNA-wise, we're only one chromosome away from a pig, so we're nothing to do with monkeys and chimpanzees and apes and all that. Yes, they're somewhere further down the line, but that's not what we're the closest to. But that's been known for years. Darwin's laws of modification and adaptation, and yes, they're fine, no issues with those at all. But nothing changes into anything else. And I think Darwin knew that. He actually admitted that as time went on, science would eventually, put that theory to bed. But it's taken too long. So like you say, being connected, having the internet, being able to get the truth out there now, and actually being able to say, no, that's not right, but this is right, and, pushing the boundaries, it's enabling us worldwide to move at a much faster pace. There are still things, though, that I think are covered up in inverted commas. I think there are still things that the powers that be probably don't want people in general to know. Some of that, I think, is social structuring. Some of it's political. Some of it, I just don't think it's necessary for everybody to know. It's not relevant. It's not important. If there is something, though, that does come out that is really, really vital, I think now it has wings, it flies, it goes all around the world, people do get to know about it eventually. God bless the whistleblowers, long may they reign. Hopefully that little book I put out as well will inspire others to say, no, we're not really sure about this. This isn't right. This needs correcting. And, it'd be nice if it's just the first step. It needs to be the first of a string of books that start to bring forward what's actually physically out there and what's physically happened, what people are physically discovering. So, yeah, I think there has definitely been, 101 different reasons why things have been covered up. I personally don't necessarily approve of that. I have to say that. I don't like the idea that, you dig something up, you discover something, and then you keep it a secret. I'm not a great fan of doing that. I'm really not. But you'll gather that from the book.
Mm-hmm. And the book has great reviews, by the way, Mark. I thought
Oh, thank you.
The image on the front of the book, is that actually your skull? That's a fascinating image.
It's an interesting story behind that, actually, digressing slightly. I mocked that image up. I did it as a mock-up to say, this is what I would like the cover to look like. And I sent it to the publisher. And the publisher went, yeah, fine, fantastic. I've got the image for the front cover now. And I'm like, well, hang on. Whoa, that's just a rough artwork. And he's like, no, that'll do. That's fine. We'll just improve the quality. That'll do. It's a reproduction. The outside crystal is a reproduction of the Mitchell Hedges skull, because I wanted one that was really clear. A lot of crystal skulls are not clear. They're milky, or they're frosted, or they have patterns inside them. Because inside the crystal skull, I wanted to introduce the image of a human skull. So you have this idea that the physical is encased within, if you like, the spiritual. You've got this mystical outer skull encasing the physical and the inner skull. And I thought that really sort of captured the content of what I was aiming for inside the book. But now the publishers just went, no, we're quite happy with this. This image will do. Bang, there it goes on the front cover. I'm like, wasn't really quite what I had in mind, but it seems to have done the trick.
well, you mentioned, they were right, because it is a stunner, and it definitely expresses those things that you were mentioning, versus that like smoky quartz, but or the milky.
Just to answer your question, my own skull is inside the book. If you have a look inside the book, there's actually a full-page photo of an Aztec skull, and you'll see that it's quite frosted, it's quite milky. That's mine. Mine's on the inside.
That's fascinating. Now, through your research, a question that abounds in my mind is, are these crystal skulls still being found? Have they all been found? And how many crystal skulls, if so, have been found?
Right, that's a really important question, actually. The answer is, I think that there are plenty more out there to be found. By that, I mean the genuine ones. The problem we've got now is there are tens of thousands of modern, machine-made, man-made skulls that are just coming out every year. The market's completely flooded by them. Everything in size, from tiny little, sort of keyring size ones right the way up to twice life size and bigger. All of them are machine-made. All of them are modern. You can easily identify them by just looking at them under a magnifying glass, because you'll see the machine marks on them, the tool marks, etc. None of them are particularly old. So what you have to do then is you have to sort of turn the clock back, if you like, to try and see where the real ones are. I would say a real one, there's criteria in the book for a real one. It needs to be life-size, preferably not newborn, bigger than newborn, but it needs to be life-size. It needs to be handmade, so it's obviously got to be, shaped, fashioned, and polished, and you can tell that it's handmade. Artistically, it'd be nice to have some kind of an echo of a time period about it. The way mine's shaped, it just looks exactly like the Aztec carvings. There's no doubt about that. There's a new dating method coming in now where they look at the water content within stone, because the exposed surfaces dry out. So if you know what the basic water content of the stone is, you can almost get a sense of how old it is by how dry the outer surface is. So you would expect, if any of these skulls were analysed, that it would come back as at least a few hundred years or older in terms of them drying out. But that's the only scientific method. That's the only scientific way of actually examining them. From an archaeologist's point of view, how many real ones are there in the world? I'm going to shock everybody now by saying 2. There are only 2. One of them appears in the book. There's a jungle city called Costa, and I visited it when I was in the Yucatan. I went down there, took a photo of a skull that is bang in the middle of the ballpark at Costa. One of their ball arenas has this milky white skull set in the floor right in the middle of it, and it's always been there. It's there on the archaeological reports. It's never been moved. It's not a fake, and it's white quartz. So that one's real. And then there's an archaeological report that came out quite a few years ago now from Mexico City, where a skull that was slightly bigger than hand size, so it still qualifies, had been found buried in a ceremonial context inside, I believe it came from inside one of the pyramids. But what's happening now in South America is that the guys out there, the archaeologists, are not telling people when these things are turning up. Because obviously if the site gets out or information about the find gets out, then the sites get raided and the damage to the sites is quite extensive. And also the skulls themselves are national treasures. You know, as far as South America is concerned, really they should all go back there because that's where they belong. And after hundreds of years of these things being picked up and taken away, I think they've finally drawn a line under it and said, no, you know, we're not, if we find any more, we're not going to tell you unless we want to. You know, that's the end of it. We're fed up with having these things nicked all the time. So, you know, we're hanging on to them. So I know of two. I just know of two that have archaeological, secure, documented locations. I'm inclined to think that the Mitchell Hedges skull is real because Mitchell Hedges was an archaeologist. That's what he was, and he was quite good at what he did. So I'd like to think that one is also real. So that would take that total up to 3. Not many, I'm afraid.
That's neat. Well, I still find it fascinating because humans, as you know, are we're good at, if there is something that we find powerful or performing esoteric rites, it is deemed magnificent, we will reproduce it. And
yes.
You know, Aztec spiritual beliefs and ceremonies placed major significance on the human skull.
Yeah.
And another question that is fascinating to me as I scratch the surface compared to your research is the weight of some of these skulls. They are quite heavy. Yes,
they are. There's people don't think of crystals as containing any form of metal. But there's you have this thing called lead crystal, which is glass that's been infused with lead to produce a much brighter, clearer, crisper type of glass. So silica itself, silicon, I think it's silicon dioxide, I think is the one that they fuse with most things. That will mix with a lot of other different kinds of metals and elements and substances to produce different things, different properties. So that will increase the weight of the object that you're picking up. The one that springs to mind most, actually, is you can pick up skulls made of all kinds of different forms of silica, and some of them are just as heavy as they look. Some of them are not. Some of them are considerably heavier than they look. So perhaps, you know, if somebody wanted to experiment with that, go and find a New Age crystal fair somewhere, and there'll be a stall there that'll be selling these skulls, and they usually have a row of usually hand-sized ones that are all about the same size. There might be 8 or 10 skulls in a row, and just very carefully with 2 fingers, just go along and pick them up one after another. And I think people would be surprised by the difference. You know, if you pick one up that's tiger's eye as compared to one that's agate, as compared to one that's quartz, compared to one that's amethyst and so on, you'd be surprised by just how different the weights are, even though they're all the same size. So, yeah, the quartz ones, the actual clear quartz ones, they are shockingly heavy compared to the size. You know, the weight to size ratio is quite amazing. Like I say, the one I've got, obviously it's really solid and it does pack a punch when you pick it up. It's a lot heavier than it looks.
Yeah. I guess 30 to 78 pounds is not uncommon. And this is just mind-blowing to me because this is not something that would be easy to carry around. So it would be a really big deal, especially in rituals and esoteric rites. And I'm also fascinated, Mark, that the only way science seems to estimate, at least currently, is these crystal carvings is by examining the surface to see if there's any evidence of how it was carved. And the origin seems to be mysterious because part of the issue is quartz crystal is a natural stone that comes from the earth. Therefore, we can't really carbon date it. That's quite a quandary.
No. Yeah, I've run across this very recently, actually. It's interesting because some friends of mine who are doing this exhibition in the summer have a very large, what appears to me to be volcanic obsidian crystal skull, which looks like it's been, it's very primitive kind of green bottle glass, if you like, and it looks like it's been remelted or reformed to produce the skull, and then hand carved afterwards. So the skull itself is cast in some way, and then afterwards they've sort of pecked a lot of detail into it. Stylistically, again, potentially round about the Spanish Conquistador period. So you're looking at somewhere in the 1500s, possibly, based on style. But they had the same idea you did. They actually managed to get some material off this skull and sent it away for carbon dating. And it came back to something like 13,000 BC. But as soon as I read the report, as soon as I looked at what they'd actually done, I said, well, that's not the skull. That's the soil it was buried in. So you can date where it came from. You know, it was sat somewhere on a shelf or in a cave or a tomb or whatever. The tomb or the site had dirt in it that was that age, but that's not the age of the glass. You see what I'm getting at here?
Yeah.
The two are two separate things. It never crossed the mind to think that the glass might be completely different. And this one's going to be a real headache in the future because it's not like natural stone. The one I've got, somebody started with a socking great big crystal and they've kind of eaten the way into it till eventually they've ended up with the right size and shape of skull. It's quite nice, actually. It's clear at the back, smoky in the middle and frosted at the front. So they've done it in a certain way to create the skull the way they wanted it. But they've actually done that from natural crystal, which, you know, might be dateable. It's got the potential to be dateable. But if this thing's made from, you know, volcanic glass that's come out of a volcano that's been melted and then put back together again to create this kind of bluey-green obsidian thing, that's just impossible. You'll never get a proper date off that. You know, it's a real conundrum, that one. They are incredibly hard to date, which I think, again, is why they've tightened up the way they're looking at these carvings in South America, because the find site and where they're coming from and the paperwork and the information behind them is now more important almost than the fact that it's a crystal skull. You know, you've got to have that provenance, that background to it. Otherwise, it's just another, you know, one of tens of thousands of skulls that turn up all the time, which is disappointing if it gets to that position. You know, they're just really hard to age. The possibility of them, like you say, making these things in the past, you can imagine like the priest holding one of these up and the sun coming in and, catching this and the light beams going out from them. They must have looked absolutely spectacular. There's no reason why they wouldn't make them. Absolutely no reason at all. Because they made everything else, you know, and skulls appear on everything else. So, you know, why would you not? You know, of course you'd have a go. But I don't think we've found them all. I don't think they've all come to light yet. I think there's plenty more out there to be discovered yet.
That's great news. That adds to the mystery. And
well, it does. I mean, I was going to say, take the city of Coba. When I was there, you know, there's this vast city in the jungle. And I said to the archaeologist chap who was there, I said, well, how are you going on? You know, have you dug most of it up? He just shook his head. He went, there's less than 10% of it excavated. So 90% of the city of Coba, that's just one city, 90% of it is still nothing but jungle. It's just piles of rocks in the jungle. You know, that city alone would take many, many lifetimes to pull that back out of the jungle again. There's so much still to be found.
Fascinating. It potentially, I mean, this is just amazing. The potential of finding so many more. And I think it's also fascinating. I wish we could go into it now, but you are an author of other works that absolutely fascinate me, such as Revealing the Green Man and right up my alley, and other books, The Life and Times of the Real Robin Hood, Celtic Warrington, and Other Mysteries. Let's take this moment to tell our listeners where they can find your works, including this magnificent book, and where they can keep track of everything that you are achieving.
Okay, I try and keep things as simple as I can. It's just in my nature to do that. So all the books, everything I've ever produced, which should be Crystal Skulls and Human Heads, Revealing the Green Man, Life and Times of the Real Robin Hood, The Disappearing Ninth Legion, and 3 of the Celtic Warrington series, they're all on Amazon. So all you have to do to get them is go to Amazon, put my name in. All I would say is if you go for the Robin Hood book, it's spelt differently. It's ROBYNHOODE. So if you put that into your search engine, you'll get there. But at the end of the day, Amazon, they're all on there. That's the place to go for that. Anybody wants to get me, find me, the easiest way to do it, I have a totally open Facebook page. You can go and find me on there. There aren't many people with my name. You'll know it's me because I'm holding a crystal ball on the photograph, okay? It's this blue-coloured photo of me with a crystal ball, so it's quite obviously me. You can message me there on Messenger, or you can just leave a message on the thread or whatever. And if you really want to get into it, you want to book me, you want to talk about more stuff or whatever, because I do talks and all that sort of thing, we can flip over to emails from there. But that's really the window to the world, if you like. So it's either Amazon for the books or Facebook for me. Dead simple.
That is great. And I'm blown away by the actual archaeological and historic case studies taking place, all your work, all the time and effort you've put into this. I can't thank you enough for coming on the podcast. And any other important attributes or reveals that you see coming in the future?
Wow, what's for the future? I am writing a couple of books, and there's another one finished, which I haven't really talked about to anybody yet, but I'm actually looking for a publisher for one at the moment. I have completely and utterly nailed the whole of the King Arthur legends. So there's a huge book on King Arthur, 477 pages. For those of you that are only listening, by the way, he's got a massive smile on his face and the thumbs just went up.
I do.
So I absolutely nailed it. I nailed King Arthur. It's took 44 years to produce the book, so that gives you some idea of how in-depth this thing is. And I just need a publisher that's going to go, I don't care, it's 477 pages, I'm going to publish it. So I want to get that out as soon as possible, so that's coming. And then there's a couple of other books coming in the wings. There's a little sort of Templar thing going on, something to do with some biblical stuff, to do with scrolls and lost language stuff in that direction. That's probably the most I can give away really at this stage. But there's plenty more. There's loads more coming.
Oh, I can't wait!
An exclusive for you.
I'm chomping. I'm chomping at the bit. Not only to see that, and then also hopefully in the future to talk to you about revealing the Green Man, because your work is just it's great. Thank you so much, Mark.
I was just going to say the revealing the Green Man is actually connected. Because what it looks at is connected to the work in the Crystal Skulls book. And if anyone wants to come and see me in person, like I said, I'm at Awakening. It's called Awakening. It's a conference at Blackpool, and I believe it's on in June, so towards the end of June. So if folks want to try and look that up and book onto Awakening, it's Zohar that are putting it on. It's a production company we have over here. So there you go. That's it.
I love Zohar. I love Zohar. Everything they touch seems to turn to gold. I love that stuff. Thank you so much, Mark. Can't thank you enough. I wish you the best in all your endeavors, and thank you for everything you're doing for the rest of us.
Same for you. Thanks for having me.
Well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Mark Olly, someone who has pursued a solo career as a writer, archaeologist, and television presenter. This career has so far taken him to all parts of the UK, France, Egypt, Norway, and Italy, Bulgaria, Cyprus, South America, Turkey, Malta, and North Africa in search of the ancient and the mysterious. Amazing talking to him. I'm so glad he came on the podcast. I hope that you found some tidbits that add to the mystery of the crystal skulls. Until next time, keep your eyes to the skies, feet on the ground, but don't forget to take a look around.
Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off, blast off. Come blast off in my time machine. Third eye feeling like an Visine. Blast off, blast off, blast off.